Imagine this. You wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, sweat cooling on your skin. For a moment, you don't recognize the room around you or even the body you inhabit. A memory sharp, unwelcome has torn through the veil of sleep. It doesn't belong to your present, yet it defines you more powerfully than the name on your driver's license or the reflection in your mirror. This memory, this wound from your past, has become woven into the very fabric of who you believe yourself to be. Who would you be without your scars? It's a question that haunts the spaces between thoughts, the suggestion that perhaps our deepest wounds are not merely events that happen to us, but architects of our very consciousness. Consider the paradox. The parts of ourselves we most desperately wish to escape often become the foundations upon which we build our identities. The childhood rejection that makes you overachieve. The betrayal that keeps you vigilant in every relationship. The loss that makes you cling too tightly to what remains. These wounds don't just leave marks, they become the lens through which you perceive every subsequent experience. What if the story you tell yourself about who you are is actually a protective fiction, born from the moments when you felt most vulnerable? What if your personality, the traits you consider most essentially you, are actually sophisticated defense mechanisms, crystallized responses to pain that once served you, but now confine you? The boundary between trauma and identity blurs into something indistinguishable. Where does the wound end and the self begin? How much of what you call me is actually the shadow cast by experiences you never fully metabolized? This is not merely an academic question for therapists' offices or philosophy seminars. It strikes at the heart of human existence, the terrifying possibility that we are, in large part, elaborate responses to our own suffering, walking adaptations to pain rather than authentic expressions of potential. What awaits beyond this realization is either liberation or terror, depending on how deeply you're willing to question the story you've been telling yourself about who you really are. The relationship between trauma and identity isn't simply an unfortunate side effect of difficult experiences. It's a profound psychological mechanism with deep evolutionary, philosophical, and neurological underpinnings. To understand why trauma becomes so deeply embedded in our sense of self, we must first recognize that identity itself is not a fixed entity, but rather a narrative construction, a story we tell ourselves about who we are. Friedrich Nietzsche recognized this when he wrote, "The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed is everything." We retroactively create meaning from our experiences, particularly those that threaten our very existence or understanding of the world. The traumatized mind doesn't simply record pain, it reorganizes itself around it. As Jean-Paul Sartre might observe, trauma forces a confrontation with the raw, unmediated experience of existence that shatters our comfortable illusions. Psychologically, this phenomenon is explained through what Carl Jung termed the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we reject or cannot face directly. Trauma pushes elements of our experience into this shadow realm, where they don't disappear, but rather exert control from behind the scenes. We build elaborate psychological architectures to accommodate these unintegrated experiences. The abused child doesn't simply remember mistreatment. They become hypervigilant, developing a nervous system exquisitely attuned to detecting potential harm. This vigilance becomes not something they do, but something they are. Viktor Frankl, having survived the Holocaust, understood this process intimately. In Man's Search for Meaning, he observed how quickly prisoners in concentration camps adapted their entire personalities to the brutal reality of their circumstances, not as a conscious choice, but as an inevitable psychological response to extreme suffering. What begins as adaptation becomes, with frightening speed, identity itself. Neurologically, we now understand this process through the lens of neuroplasticity. Trauma literally reshapes the brain, strengthening neural pathways associated with fear and defensive responses, while weakening connections to areas responsible for rational assessment and emotional regulation. The body keeps the score, as trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk famously noted, encoding experiences of threat at a cellular level that transcends conscious memory. This biological encoding creates what psychologists call emotional memory implicit, bodily knowledge that operates below the threshold of awareness. Your racing heart in social situations isn't simply remembering past rejections, it's reliving them. Your reflexive anger when feeling controlled doesn't reference childhood powerlessness, it reproduces it in real time. The philosophical implications are profound. If Arthur Schopenhauer was correct that we are what we have been, then trauma represents not simply something that happened to us, but a fundamental alteration of what we are. The traumatized person doesn't merely carry wounds, they have become, in a very real sense, the wound itself organizing their entire perception of reality around preventing its recurrence. This is why addressing trauma proves so difficult. We resist healing not only because recovery is painful, but because recovery threatens to dismantle the very structures of self we've built to survive. Who am I if not my hypervigilance? What remains of me if I relinquish the protective rage I've carried for decades? These aren't merely psychological questions, but existential ones that strike at the very core of being. The most insidious aspect of this hidden mechanism is its invisibility to the self. We don't experience our trauma responses as choices or strategies, but as reality itself, the water in which we swim, too close to be seen clearly. This is why philosopher Aldous Huxley observed that the greatest challenge isn't obtaining new ideas, but escaping from old ones. The prison of trauma-shaped identity locks from the inside, with no recognition that alternative ways of being are even possible. The consequences of this trauma identity fusion extend far beyond individual suffering. They ripple outward, shaping relationships, communities, and entire societies in ways we rarely acknowledge. When trauma becomes identity, its effects become invisible precisely because they're omnipresent, like gravity or oxygen, not experienced as distinct forces, but as the background conditions of existence itself. Consider how trauma alters perception at the most fundamental level. The brain's primary function isn't to create happiness, but to ensure survival. Neurological research reveals that traumatized brains prioritize threat detection over accuracy, pleasure, or connection. This isn't a conscious choice, but an automatic neurological adaptation. The amygdala, our brain's alarm system, becomes hypersensitive, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for nuanced assessment, becomes underactive. This creates what psychologists call trauma goggles, a perceptual filter that scans reality primarily for danger rather than opportunity. What does this mean in practice? It means the person whose identity has been shaped by betrayal doesn't simply fear betrayal, they unconsciously organize their reality to confirm its inevitability. The slight hesitation in a lover's response becomes definitive evidence of impending abandonment. The neutral email from a boss transforms into certain criticism. This isn't paranoia, it's the brain's attempt to protect by anticipating threats before they materialize. As cognitive psychologist Aaron Beck identified, these cognitive distortions don't feel like interpretations, but like direct perceptions of reality itself. The social consequences are equally profound. Trauma researcher Peter Levine notes how unprocessed trauma creates rigid behavioral patterns that paradoxically recreate the very conditions they evolved to protect against. The child emotionally neglected by distant parents becomes an adult who maintains emotional distance in relationships, perpetuating the very isolation they most fear. The person physically abused develops a hair-trigger defensive anger that pushes away the very connection they crave. These aren't choices, but automatic programs running below conscious awareness. Perhaps most insidiously, trauma-shaped identity creates what psychologist Robert Firestone calls the critical inner voice, an internalized dialogue that maintains the trauma-based worldview against all evidence to the contrary. This voice ensures that even success, connection, and safety are experienced as temporary anomalies, rather than evidence contradicting the trauma narrative. They only like you because they don't really know you. This won't last. You don't deserve this. These thoughts aren't experienced as optional perspectives, but as fundamental truths. At a collective level, unprocessed trauma shapes cultural narratives, political movements, and even international relations. Societies that have experienced historical trauma develop collective defense mechanisms that can persist for generations. As cultural philosopher René Girard observed, groups often unconsciously organize around mimetic desire and scapegoating mechanisms that reproduce traumatic patterns at a societal scale. The abused becomes the abuser. The oppressed becomes the oppressor, not through conscious choice, but through the invisible hand of unmetabolized collective trauma. Neuroscientist Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory helps explain why these patterns prove so resistant to change. Trauma doesn't just create psychological adaptations, but physiological ones, altering our very nervous system's capacity to regulate itself. The body becomes locked in states of hyperarousal or hyperarousal, making it biologically difficult to access the regulated state necessary for connection, creativity, and change. This creates a devastating catch-22 healing, requires precisely the physiological state that trauma has made most difficult to access. The ultimate unseen consequence is a profound disconnection from potential. Trauma-based identity doesn't just shape who we think we are, it constrains who we might become. Possibilities that lie outside the trauma narrative become literally unimaginable. The psychological immune system developed to protect against past pain becomes the invisible fence containing future growth. And tragically, this confinement is experienced not as restriction, but as realism, not as a viewpoint, but as the nature of reality itself. The journey beyond trauma-formed identity begins with a radical act of recognition. What you've been calling reality is actually a perspective, a particular arrangement of attention shaped by survival needs that have outlived their usefulness. This recognition isn't merely intellectual. It must penetrate to the level of felt experience. As philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty understood, the most powerful revelations occur not in thought, but in perception itself when we literally begin to see differently. This perceptual shift requires what Buddhist traditions call beginner's mind, a willingness to encounter experience without the automatic categorizations of the conditioned self. It means developing what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to observe your own thoughts rather than being fully identified with them. I am having the thought that I'm unworthy carries fundamentally different implications than I am unworthy. This slight shift creates a space between identity and experience, a gap through which new possibilities can emerge. Counterintuitively, freedom begins not with changing your traumatic responses, but with fully acknowledging them. Psychoanalyst Carl Jung noted that what you resist persists, what you embrace transforms. Modern trauma therapies like somatic experiencing and internal family systems recognize that healing occurs not by fighting against trauma responses, but by understanding their protective intent. Your hypervigilance, emotional numbness, or reflexive anger weren't character flaws, but sophisticated survival mechanisms, parts of yourself doing their best with the information available at the time. This compassionate reframing allows what therapist Richard Schwartz calls unburdening the release of frozen emotional energy that has remained trapped in the nervous system. Neurologically, this process involves activating what Stephen Porges terms the ventral vagal pathway, the physiological state that enables social connection, creativity, and healing. Through practices that regulate the nervous system from breath work to movement to safe relational connections, we can gradually expand our window of tolerance, making it possible to process experiences that were once too overwhelming to face. Historical examples offer powerful testimony to this possibility of transformation. Viktor Frankl's observations in Nazi concentration camps revealed that even under the most extreme conditions, some individuals maintained what he called the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude toward suffering. James Baldwin transformed the pain of racial trauma into profound literary insight, noting that people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them, yet demonstrating through his own life how this trap might be escaped, not by denying history's reality, but by confronting it with unflinching awareness. More recently, trauma researchers like Bessel van der Kolk have documented how methodologies like EMDR eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, and neurofeedback can help the brain reprocess traumatic memories, moving them from implicit emotional memory to explicit narrative memory, from something you are to something that happened to you. This neurological shift mirrors the philosophical insight articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre: existence precedes essence. We are not determined by our past, but continually redefining ourselves through present choices. The most radical break from trauma-based identity comes through what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi identified as flow states experiences of complete absorption that temporarily suspend the narrative self. In moments of creative engagement, deep connection with others, or immersion in nature, we glimpse a self not defined by its wounds, but by its capacity for presence. These experiences aren't mere escapes, but glimpses of an alternative way of being evidence that the trauma-based self is not all that we are. The rebellion against trauma-shaped identity ultimately requires a leap of faith, a willingness to act as if new possibilities exist before you can fully perceive them. As philosopher Søren Kierkegaard understood, transformation often requires moving beyond the rational into a territory where certainty is impossible. You must be willing to risk the security of the known self, however painful for the potential of a self not yet realized. This is not healing as typically conceived, not a return to some pre-traumatized state, but rather what post-traumatic growth researchers call constructive transformation. You don't overcome trauma by reverting to who you were before it occurred, but by integrating it into a more expansive, nuanced, and resilient understanding of self, one that includes but is not defined by your wounds. The deeper you journey into understanding trauma's relationship to identity, the more a profound paradox emerges. The very wounds that have confined you also contain the seeds of your most authentic liberation. This isn't poetic metaphor, but psychological reality, what Jung called the treasure hard to attain that lies within our deepest suffering. Consider what trauma fundamentally is, not simply pain, but an encounter with reality too intense, too threatening to be integrated into your existing understanding of self and world. Trauma occurs precisely at the boundary where your conceptual framework, your map of reality, fails to accommodate your actual experience. In this sense, trauma marks not only damage, but an opportunity for expansion, a tear in the fabric of your constructed self, through which something more real might emerge. This realization turns conventional wisdom about trauma on its head. The goal isn't merely to heal trauma in the sense of neutralizing its pain, but to recognize it as a portal to a more fundamental truth about human existence itself. As philosopher Martin Heidegger understood, it's often only when our everyday coping mechanisms break down that we encounter the raw fact of our being, what he called thrownness into existence, without predetermined meaning. Those who have moved through the full arc of trauma integration often describe not just relief from suffering, but access to capacities and insights unavailable to their pre-traumatized selves. Research on post-traumatic growth consistently identifies transformations that transcend mere recovery, deeper connection to others,
greater emotional range, enhanced creativity,
and a more nuanced relationship to meaning itself. The trauma survivor doesn't simply return to normal, but discovers a new normal that includes greater awareness of both vulnerability and strength. The ultimate revelation lies in recognizing that identity itself, the very notion of a fixed, consistent self, is both the source of trauma's power and the primary obstacle to its resolution. Trauma becomes so deeply embedded in identity precisely because we cling to the fiction of a continuous, separate self that must maintain coherence at all costs. This is why Buddhist psychologist Mark Epstein suggests that trauma and enlightenment are not opposed, but intimately related. Both involve the dissolution of our ordinary sense of self. What emerges from this understanding isn't just a therapeutic technique, but an existential orientation, the capacity to hold identity itself more lightly, to recognize your self-concept as a useful, but ultimately provisional construction, rather than an immutable reality. The question shifts from who am I in light of my trauma, to the more liberating, what becomes possible when I'm not defined by any fixed concept of self? This isn't abstract philosophy, but practical liberation. When identity becomes fluid rather than fixed, trauma loses its defining power. The painfully familiar narrative of damaged goods or survivor becomes just one story among many you might tell about your experience, not a fundamental truth, but a perspective you can engage or release depending on its usefulness in any given moment. Ironically, it's often those who have faced the deepest trauma who arrive at this realization most profoundly. Having had the illusion of a secure, predictable self shattered by overwhelming experience, they're positioned to recognize what Zen teachers have long maintained. Security based on fixed identity, was always an illusion. The ground of being lies not in conceptual stability, but in the capacity to remain present with the perpetual flow of experience itself, including experiences of loss, pain, and disintegration. This perspective doesn't trivialize trauma's devastation or suggest that suffering itself is somehow desirable. Rather, it acknowledges that once trauma has occurred, integration rather than erasure becomes the path forward. The wound doesn't disappear, but becomes permeable, no longer a barrier separating you from life, but a passage through which life flows with greater authenticity. Perhaps this is what T.S. Eliot meant when he wrote that the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. The journey through trauma's labyrinth ultimately returns you to the present moment, but with eyes that see more clearly, a heart more capable of holding complexity, and a sense of self spacious enough to accommodate both suffering and joy without being defined by either. In this light, the relationship between trauma and identity reveals itself not as a problem to be solved, but as a koan to be lived, an impossible question that, when held with sufficient presence, dissolves the questioner into a more fundamental reality. Who would you be without your wounds? Perhaps not someone different, but simply more fully yourself, not defined by what has happened to you, but engaged with what is happening now, in this moment of endless possibility.